You woke up feeling fine. You slept through the night. You had breakfast. Maybe you even made plans for the morning. And then somehow before 10 o'clock something changed. Your energy was still there when you woke up. But now it feels as if someone quietly turned it down. You're not exhausted after a long day. You haven't done anything especially difficult. You simply find yourself thinking, maybe I'll sit down for a minute. Margaret noticed that feeling one morning. It began like any other morning. She opened the curtains and let the sunlight into her bedroom. The house was quiet. Outside, the neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. Margaret felt good. Not unusually energetic. Not tired either. Just good. She went into the kitchen and started making breakfast. Coffee first. Then toast, some fruit, and a glass of water. Nothing unusual. She moved around the kitchen easily, thinking about everything she wanted to get done that morning. She had planned to stop by the market later. She wanted to check on a few things around the house. And if the weather stayed nice, she thought she might spend some time outside. At 8 o'clock, she felt completely fine. At 9, she still did. But sometime after that, Margaret noticed herself standing quietly at the kitchen counter. She looked toward the clock. Then she pulled out a chair. She wasn't dizzy. Nothing hurt. She wasn't struggling to stand. She simply didn't feel like continuing just yet. Margaret sat down. For a moment she wondered why. The morning had started so well. So where had that energy gone? And more importantly, why had it disappeared before the morning was even over? A little later that morning, Margaret decided to keep her plans. She picked up her bag, locked the front door, and drove to the local farmer's market. By the time she arrived, the sun was higher and the market was busy without feeling crowded. Vendors were arranging baskets of peaches and tomatoes. Someone nearby was pouring coffee. A young father was helping his daughter choose flowers. Margaret liked mornings like this. They made her feel connected to the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. She walked slowly between the stands, stopping to look at herbs, bread, and fresh produce. First she felt fine. Then she saw Linda near a table of apples. Linda waved. Margaret smiled and walked over. "Perfect timing," Linda said. "I was about to get coffee." Margaret laughed. "Make that too." They bought their drinks and continued through the market together. A few minutes later, Linda stopped to examine a basket of strawberries. Margaret stopped too. But instead of looking at the fruit, she noticed how good it felt simply to stand still. Linda glanced over. "You okay?" "I'm fine." Margaret meant it. She wasn't short of breath. She wasn't in pain. She just felt quieter than she had when she left home. Linda studied her for a moment. "You seem a little tired." Margaret looked down at her coffee. "That's the strange part." She smiled faintly. "I felt great this morning. And now?" Margaret looked toward a nearby bench. "I think my energy disappeared somewhere between breakfast and here." Linda smiled with recognition. "You know, that happens to me too." Margaret turned toward her. "It does. More often than I'd like." For a moment, neither woman said anything. Around them, the market kept moving. People carried bags. Vendors called to customers. A bicycle rolled past at the edge of the street. Nothing about the morning seemed unusual. And yet both women recognized the same experience. A morning could begin with plans, energy, and the feeling that there was plenty of day ahead. Then, before much had happened, the body seemed to ask for a pause. Margaret had always assumed those mornings meant one simple thing. She was getting older. But standing there beside Linda, she began to wonder whether that explanation was too easy. If the feeling kept appearing, perhaps it was worth noticing more carefully. Not fearing. Not diagnosing. Just noticing. Because Margaret was beginning to learn that small changes sometimes became more useful when she stopped judging them and started asking better questions. And now she had one. Was this really just part of getting older? Or was there more to the story of where her morning energy went? On the drive home, Margaret kept thinking about the conversation at the market. She had heard the phrase, "I'm just getting older," so many times that it had almost become an explanation for everything. A little less energy. A little more time getting ready in the morning. A little more time before feeling ready to start the day. Maybe that was simply what happened with age. But something about that explanation didn't quite satisfy her. Margaret still had plenty of mornings when she felt energetic. She still drove herself to the market. She still worked in her garden. She still made her own meals and kept up with the things she enjoyed. So why did some mornings feel completely different from others? When she got home, Margaret put the groceries away and sat for a moment at the kitchen table. She looked at the clock. It wasn't even 10:30. She thought about how different she had felt only a few hours earlier. That morning, she had woken up feeling rested. She hadn't expected to feel tired so soon. And she realized there was something else that bothered her. She didn't want to start treating every change in her energy as proof that something was wrong. But she also didn't want to ignore a pattern simply because she was getting older. That distinction felt important. Maybe the better question wasn't, why am I getting tired? Maybe it was, when does this happen, and what else is happening around it? Margaret thought about the night before. She thought about breakfast, how much water she had had, how active she had been, even how she had been feeling emotionally that morning. There were more pieces to the puzzle than she had realized. Later that afternoon, Linda called. "I've been thinking about what we talked about," Linda said. "Me too," Margaret replied. Linda laughed softly. "Maybe we should stop blaming everything on age." Margaret smiled. Maybe. Neither woman was trying to prove that aging had nothing to do with it. They simply realized that getting older was not an answer by itself. It was a reason to pay closer attention. So Margaret decided to bring the question to Dr. Carter. Not because she thought something was seriously wrong, and not because she wanted a quick explanation. She simply wanted to understand what might be happening during those mornings when her energy seemed to disappear too soon. And Dr. Carter's first question would make her look at her mornings in a completely different way. The next morning, Margaret sat across from Dr. Carter in his office. She wasn't there because she had suddenly become ill. She simply wanted to understand something that had started happening often enough to catch her attention. Dr. Carter listened as Margaret described her mornings. She told him how she could wake up feeling rested, eat breakfast, begin her usual routine, and then feel her energy fading before 10. When she finished, Dr. Carter didn't immediately tell her what was causing it. Instead, he asked a question. "How well have you been sleeping?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Usually pretty well." He nodded. "And what does your morning usually look like?" Margaret described breakfast, coffee, getting dressed, driving to the market, doing things around the house. Dr. Carter listened carefully. Then he asked, "How much water do you usually drink in the morning?" Margaret paused. "Probably not as much as I should." Dr. Carter smiled gently. "And what about activity? Stress? How you're feeling emotionally?" Margaret looked surprised. She had expected one simple answer. Instead, he was asking about several ordinary parts of her life. Dr. Carter explained that morning energy isn't controlled by one single switch inside the body. How someone feels during the morning can be influenced by many things, including sleep, food, hydration, activity, stress, and individual health factors. And those things don't necessarily affect every morning in exactly the same way. Margaret thought about that. So there may not be one reason? Not necessarily, Dr. Carter said. And one tired morning doesn't tell us very much by itself. He paused. What's more useful is noticing whether there is a pattern. Margaret remembered the question she had asked herself the day before. Where did my energy go? Maybe that wasn't quite the right question. Maybe she needed to ask something more specific. When does the change happen? What happened before it? And does it keep happening? For the first time, Margaret understood that paying attention to her energy didn't mean searching for something wrong with herself. It meant gathering information. Just as she had learned to notice the ground before taking a step, she could learn to notice what was happening before her energy began to change. And that gave her something she hadn't had before. A way to observe instead of worry. The following morning, Margaret decided not to change everything at once. Instead, she simply paid closer attention. She wrote down when she went to bed, how she felt when she woke up, and what her morning looked like. She didn't turn it into a complicated routine. She just noticed. On the first morning, she woke feeling rested. She had breakfast, drank her usual coffee, and started getting ready for the day. Around 9:30, she noticed the familiar dip in energy. The next morning was different. She had slept a little better, drank more water, and spent a few minutes outside before breakfast. That morning, the change came later. Margaret didn't immediately decide that she had found the answer. She simply wrote it down. A few days passed. Some mornings felt easy, others didn't. Sometimes the change came before 10. Sometimes it came later. And occasionally, she went through the entire morning without thinking about her energy at all. That surprised her. She had expected to discover one simple cause. Instead, she was discovering something more useful. Her mornings were not identical. Neither was the way her body responded to them. One afternoon, Margaret told Linda what she had been doing. Linda smiled. "So you're keeping track now?" "Not exactly," Margaret said. "I'm just paying attention." She laughed. "I don't want to turn breakfast into a science experiment." Linda laughed too. "But I do want to know what's normal for me." That sentence stayed with Margaret. She realized she wasn't trying to prove that she could have endless energy. She wasn't trying to feel 20 years younger. She simply wanted to understand her own pattern well enough to notice when something changed. And that made the question feel different. Instead of asking, "Why can't I do what I used to do?" Margaret was beginning to ask, "What does a good morning look like for me now?" For the first time, that question didn't feel like giving something up. It felt like learning something new. A few weeks later, Margaret noticed something she hadn't expected. She wasn't necessarily more energetic every morning. She still had days when she wanted to slow down. But she understood those days differently now. Instead of immediately thinking, "Something must be wrong," she paid attention. How had she slept? What had her morning looked like? Had she been drinking enough water? Had she been rushing? And most importantly, was this something that kept happening? That small change in thinking gave Margaret a sense of control she hadn't realized she had lost. She didn't need every morning to feel exactly the way it had when she was 50. She needed to understand what was normal for her now. One morning, Margaret and Linda were walking together through a different part of town. They had left the familiar garden behind and were heading toward a small cafe they both liked. Margaret stepped onto the sidewalk. She slowed for just a moment. Linda noticed. "Everything okay?" Margaret looked down, then smiled. "Yes, I'm just checking my step." She continued walking. But this time something occurred to her. She had become much better at noticing the moment before she moved. The ground. Her position. Her pace. Her confidence. And suddenly she wondered about something else. What if that same feeling of uncertainty didn't happen only when she was walking? What if sometimes it appeared when the environment changed unexpectedly? A busy sidewalk. A crowded store. A curb she hadn't noticed. A change from bright sunlight to shade. Why could someone feel perfectly capable one moment and suddenly feel a little unsteady the next? Margaret didn't know the answer, and she wasn't going to guess, because by now she had learned something important. A sensation doesn't always tell you its own explanation. Sometimes the better response is to become curious about what happened just before it. And that was the question Margaret would explore next. Why do some people suddenly feel unsteady after 70? Even when their legs seem perfectly capable, the answer may have less to do with weakness than most people assume.